Imagine you inherit the most powerful empire on earth, not a kingdom, an empire, one that stretches from the sands of Egypt all the way to the mountains of India, one that controls nearly half of every human being alive. Now imagine the first thing on your to-do list is finishing a war your father started and lost. That's where Xerxes I begins his story, and it is one of the most dramatic, brutal, and ultimately tragic stories in all of ancient history. Because Xerxes wasn't just a king, he was a force, a man who commanded the largest army ever assembled in the ancient world, who burned Athens to the ground, who almost changed the entire course of Western civilization. And yet, if you've heard of him at all, you probably picture a villain from a movie. Towering, arrogant, humiliated by a handful of Spartans at a mountain pass. That's the Greek version of Xerxes, and like most things written by the winners, it only tells half the story. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's actually understand who this man was. The year is around 518 BC. Xerxes is born into the most powerful bloodline in the world. His father is Darius the Great, the man who turned Persia into an administrative masterpiece, who built roads that stretched for thousands of miles, who organized an empire of staggering complexity with ruthless efficiency. His mother is Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus the Great himself, the founder of the entire Achaemenid Empire. So when people say Xerxes had royal blood, they are not exaggerating. He was Persian royalty squared. But here's the thing about being born into that kind of legacy. It comes with expectations that would crush most people. Because Darius hadn't just left Xerxes an empire, he'd left him a problem. A very serious, very public problem. Greece. In 490 BC, Darius had tried to expand Persian power into mainland Greece. He'd sent a massive force across the Aegean Sea, and at a small coastal plain called Marathon, the Greeks did something nobody expected. They won. Not just barely. They won convincingly. The Persian army, supposedly invincible, turned around and sailed home in defeat. It was humiliating. And Darius never got his revenge because he died in 486 BC, leaving that unfinished business squarely on his son's shoulders. But before Xerxes could even think about Greece, he had fires to put out closer to home. Egypt had been restless. Darius had never fully suppressed a rebellion there, and the moment the old king died, the Egyptians saw an opportunity. High taxes and forced labor to build Persian palaces had pushed them to the edge, and they went over it. Xerxes moved fast. He deployed a large army, crushed the rebellion by 484 BC, and installed his own brother as the new governor. Message sent. Nobody gets to use a transition of power as an excuse to revolt, not on his watch. Then came Babylon. Babylon had always occupied a special place in the Persian world. Previous emperors had even adopted the title King of Babylon, as a sign of respect for the city's ancient prestige and cultural weight. Xerxes wanted none of that. He wasn't going to bow to anyone else's tradition. He called himself King of Persians and Medes, and he made clear that Babylon was just another province like any other. Nothing special, nothing sacred. The Babylonians did not take this well. Revolts broke out. Xerxes besieged the city, eventually broke through its defenses, and then did something that sent shockwaves through the ancient world. He ordered the destruction of temple walls. He melted down the golden statue of Marduk, Babylon's supreme deity, one of the most sacred objects in Mesopotamian religion. This wasn't just suppressing a rebellion. This was a statement, a deliberate, calculated erasure of the symbolic foundation that had made Babylon special for centuries. It was brutal, and it worked. With Egypt subdued and Babylon punished, Xerxes finally had the breathing room to do what he'd been building toward all along. He turned his attention west. The preparation for the Greek campaign was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Xerxes spent 4 years getting ready. 4 years of mobilizing troops from every corner of the empire. From Persia, from Media, from Egypt, from India, from Central Asia, from Ethiopia. Armies speaking dozens of languages, armed with dozens of different weapons, all converging on a single purpose: take Greece. The Greek historian Herodotus, who admittedly had every reason to paint this army as monstrously large, estimated the force at around 1 million men. Modern historians think the real number was significantly lower, perhaps somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers, plus supporting forces. But even at the more conservative estimates, this was the largest army that had ever marched on Europe. Nothing before it came close. To get this army into Europe, Xerxes did something that still astonishes engineers today. He built 2 pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. 2 floating bridges made of boats lashed together, long enough to carry an army across open water. When a storm destroyed the first set of bridges, Xerxes reportedly had the sea itself whipped 300 times as punishment, which tells you something important about the man's personality. He genuinely believed he could impose his will on the natural world itself. New bridges were built, the army crossed, and in the spring of 480 BC, Xerxes led the most formidable military force in human history into Greece. The first major confrontation came at a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, and this is where the legend really takes over, so let's be careful about what actually happened versus what got turned into myth. The Greek forces defending the pass were led by Leonidas, the Spartan king, with roughly 7,000 men from various Greek city-states. Facing them was the full weight of the Persian army. For 2 days, the Greeks held the pass. The geography was the key. The pass was so narrow that Persian numerical advantage meant almost nothing. They could only send so many men at a time, and the Greek phalanx held firm, grinding down wave after wave. Xerxes threw everything at them, including his 10,000 immortals, the elite shock force that was supposed to be unbeatable. They were beaten back too. But then a Greek man named Ephialtes, motivated by the promise of a Persian reward, revealed a mountain path that went around the defenders. Xerxes sent forces through the hidden route, and suddenly the Greek position was surrounded. Most of the Greek allies retreated. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, along with a small number of Thespians and Thebans, stayed and fought to the last man. Here's the complicated truth about Thermopylae. Tactically, Persia won. The pass fell. The road to central Greece was open. But strategically, those 3 days cost Xerxes something he never fully recovered: time, and the psychological unity it gave to the Greek resistance. Athens was next. By the time the Persian army arrived, most of the population had already evacuated on the advice of the Athenian commander Themistocles, who had convinced his city that their salvation lay not behind stone walls, but at sea. A small group of defenders remained on the Acropolis. They were killed, the city was burned, the sacred temples were destroyed. From a Persian military standpoint, it was a victory. From every other standpoint, burning the cultural heart of Greek civilization was the kind of act that hardens enemies into something more than soldiers. It turns them into avengers. The decisive moment came at sea. In the narrow straits between the mainland and the island of Salamis, the Greek fleet was waiting. Themistocles had maneuvered brilliantly. He even sent a message to Xerxes, pretending to be a Persian sympathizer, claiming the Greek fleet was planning to escape and that the Persians should blockade the strait immediately to trap them. Xerxes believed it. He ordered his fleet into the narrow waters overnight. It was exactly what Themistocles wanted. In the strait, Persian numerical superiority evaporated. The Greek ships were heavier, more maneuverable in confined space, and their crews were fighting for their survival. The Persian fleet, crammed into a choke point, became tangled and chaotic. The Greeks systematically destroyed ship after ship. Xerxes reportedly watched the disaster from a throne set up on the shore, observing his empire's naval power disintegrate in front of him. It was one of the most consequential battles in world history. If Persia had won at Salamis, the story of Western civilization as we know it likely never gets written. Xerxes pulled back to Asia with a large portion of his land army. He left his general and cousin Mardonius in charge of continuing the campaign. But the following year, at the Battle of Plataea, the Greek land forces crushed the Persian army. Mardonius was killed. The invasion was over. Xerxes never returned to Greece. He retreated to his capital at Susa and threw himself into construction. He completed and expanded his father's legendary palace complex at Persepolis, adding enormous halls, grand staircases, massive relief carvings of tribute bearers and immortal guards. Whatever his failures on the battlefield, Xerxes was a builder of the first order. The structures he left behind were so impressive that when Alexander the Great finally burned Persepolis more than a century later, apparently in revenge for the burning of Athens, the ruins were still magnificent enough to stagger the imagination. But the cost of the Greek campaign had been enormous, not just in men and ships, in money. Xerxes raised taxes across the empire to fund his building projects and pay down debts, and elevated taxation always has the same effect. It breeds resentment. Resentment breeds conspiracy. And conspiracy, in a palace full of ambitious men, breeds danger. In August of 465 BC, the danger arrived. Artabanus, the commander of the royal bodyguard, a man with access to every private corridor of the palace, conspired to kill Xerxes. According to ancient sources, he first murdered Xerxes' son Darius, and then the king himself. Just like that, one of the most powerful men who had ever lived was gone, killed not by a Greek army, not by the sea, not by any of the forces that had resisted him in his campaigns, but by his own bodyguard in the dark of a palace corridor. His third son, Artaxerxes, discovered what had happened. He moved quickly, executed Artabanus and his sons, and took the throne. The dynasty continued, but Xerxes was dead. Now here's the question that actually matters. How should we understand him? The Greek sources, especially Herodotus, are almost universally negative. Xerxes in their telling is vain, impulsive, arrogant, a tyrant who whips the sea and burns sacred temples. And some of that is probably true. The destruction of Babylonian sanctuaries was real. The burning of Athens was real. These were not the acts of a gentle ruler. But the Persian sources tell a different story. The inscriptions Xerxes left at Persepolis speak of a king devoted to order, to justice, to the protection of his people and their laws. He administered a vast, complex empire for 20 years. He kept it largely together. He suppressed rebellions without losing control. He built monuments that lasted for centuries. The truth, as it almost always does, sits somewhere in between. Xerxes was a man shaped by impossible expectations, by a legacy he could never quite escape, and by the particular cruelty that power, unchecked and total, tends to produce. He was brilliant in some moments and catastrophically overconfident in others. He changed the history of the world, even in his failures, because his failure to conquer Greece allowed Western civilization to develop along the path it did. No Xerxes, no Greek independence, potentially no Athens in its classical form, no Socrates, no Plato, no Aristotle. The philosophy that underlies modern democratic thought might have been strangled in its cradle. The man the movies made into a villain might, in his defeat, be one of the accidental architects of the world we live in today. That's the hidden history of Xerxes I, a man too big to fully understand, too complicated to simply condemn, and too consequential to ignore. If you want more stories like this one, hit that like and subscribe button. There are empires left to unravel, and the history they tried to hide is always more interesting than the version you already know.